Despicable Me 4. So Despicable Me 4 is the fourth installment in the Despicable Me franchise. The movie is directed by Chris Renaud, and it stars Steve Carell, Kristen Wiig, Will Ferrell, Joey King, and some other people. I'm sorry if my approach to this video may sound somewhat robotic in terms of how I'm describing this, and my tone of voice may seem grating. Oh folks, when you walk into an Illumination movie, you should come to expect that by now that robotic and grating is exactly what you get. Those who are returning viewers to the channel know I usually structure my videos a little differently. However, after having to sit through this movie, I had many thoughts going through my head. The first was, life isn't worth living. And then my second was, well, if it's not worth living, I should choose to live to the fullest, and in that way, not always have to make such a formulaic video, as much as I tell myself one day it'll make me money, even though I know YouTube will never pay me. This movie is just on a whole other level. So rather than just giving my usual structure, I kind of want to start mainly just talking about, I think, the story, or at least many things I found wrong about the story, because looking back on this movie, there is no story. Things just happen, and I'll kind of outline that in a bit. Some of you may find these things to be nitpicky. To that I'd say, go fuck yourself. Let's just start already. I want to get this over with so I never have to think about this movie again after making this video. So the movie starts with this reunion for villains who went to a school for villainy. Already it's doing a usual sequel trick of expanding the world in a new way, and I will give the movie this. It's something new that hasn't been discussed in this world before. It makes sense that people like Gru would go somewhere to learn how to be better villains. When Gru arrives at this reunion, we see that it's specifically catered for the class of '85, which he was a part of. In this sequence, they play two songs. The first song is Word Up by Cameo. I can't play it, of course, but you know the one. After this, we have the song Unbelievable by the band EMF. And if you don't know that one, look up the Kevin James movie where he's a zookeeper and he takes the gorilla to TGI Fridays. It's that song. So the thing about these two songs is the first one came out in 1986 and the second song came out in 1990. Look, I understand this takes place in modern day, it takes place in current year, but if you're doing a party of people whose memories mostly came from 1985 in this setting, you'd probably want to play songs from that year and the years before it, more specifically since this is the year they have probably remembered most. I mean, that's the reunion, that's the point. But no, it's just an excuse for Illumination to flex what kind of money they have already right out of the bat, that they were able to afford these songs in this sequence. After a short time, Gru arrests the villain of the movie, that's played by Will Ferrell. He's doing a weird French accent in this that I don't think really works too well. I think this is essentially the first movie who's really had a true connection with Gru. I mean, sure, Vector has this rivalry with him in the first movie, but this one in this movie goes back much further. It's much deeper than that. Again, it's something different. Unfortunately, I don't think his character does all that much until the end of the movie, which I'll get to later. When Gru returns home, he comes back to his three kids who haven't aged since the first movie. I think the writers gave some bullshit excuse that the world works in Simpsons logic, meaning the characters are basically doomed to never age, which honestly sounds like a terrifying fate. They're allowed to change voice actors, so all except for Miranda Cosgrove, who still for some reason is being asked to voice as the oldest girl. I understand that she's the oldest of the three, but if you're going with the excuse that they never aged and get someone else, I mean, my god, this woman is 31. Let her evolve. Surprisingly, they still use the same voice actress that plays the smallest, I think the smallest of the three, but I swear in this movie they pitch shift her voice up and she doesn't sound natural anymore. She always sounded like she was on the border of having a chipmunk voice, and it never reached the level of this pitch, thankfully, but it was always just very jarring. On top of that, they made her act almost like even more childish than she had in any of the other movies. It was really weird. In this same scene, the Minions come in and do an unfunny gag where they pretend to be a pit stop crew, and the filmmakers decide to play the song over this scene that is Hot for Teacher by Van Halen. And if you know anything about that song, you know it makes absolutely no sense in this context. I'm sure there's many songs NASCAR or Formula 1 uses as their soundtracks, so I don't know why the makers of Despicable Me decided to use a song about wanting to fuck your teacher. That's pretty weird. The main plot of this movie, if I can somehow try and relay it to you, is that the villain Gru arrests at the start of the movie breaks out of prison and is coming to take revenge on him. So Gru and his family have to go to a safe house where they can't be found. As they're driving there, we are treated to the obvious joke of every house looking big, grand and beautiful. Meanwhile, the house they're staying in is mediocre at best. It almost felt like some self-deprecation joke towards Illumination themselves as they look towards the animation companies making so many masterpieces around them as they continue to churn out utter mediocrity. At least they can sleep safe knowing that they somehow have better days than Disney. When the family moves in, we see what their new lives are like, which could be good for character development. However, we are treated instead to two filler scenes that come one after the other. The first shows two of Gru's girls attempting to learn karate, and the scene goes nowhere pretty much. The next is Gru's wife trying to be a hairstylist, and that almost goes nowhere until a little later on we have a follow-up scene where she gets confronted by a woman that she had fucked up her hair earlier in that scene. I'm surprised I remember so much about this movie besides almost tuning out of it, honestly. But the only reason this second follow-up scene is really in the movie is so they can shoehorn in a really lazy Terminator reference. Since Gru is put into hiding, he gets separated from his minions yet again. Illumination seems to be doing this thing in the sequels, perhaps as a means not to get called out for using the minions too much, though they still absolutely use the minions way too much because they are what make bank. But the other minions are separated, and a few of them end up being test subjects to become superhero minions. In this scene, they step into a machine and they come out as the new superhero minions with newly fitted superhero costumes just already attached to them, which makes absolutely no sense. I know that's probably one of the most nitpicky things I've talked about so far, but it was just something that, regardless of the context of the movie, still bothered me. As for the gags they do with the superhero minions, I don't really care. It's incredibly inoffensive and it's just the same joke. And it's just the same overused, overtired superhero jokes you've seen done to death, and these scenes thankfully were short. But even when they were here, I was completely bored by them. It just all ends up being a setup joke about superhero fatigue that, again, has been said to death already. Actually, there's another bit with licensed music in it that bothered me just for the fact that it was there and how it was executed. There's a scene with Joey King's character, who is this teenager who wants to be a villain, and she plays the game Dance Dance Revolution. And on it, we hear the song Through the Fire and Flames by Dragon Force. However, only the intro is played and then the game ends. This isn't how that game works if you've ever played it. You never play a section of a song before the game ends, you play the full thing, so this moment was pretty stupid. As for Joey King's character in this, I basically hated her as much as I hate her in all her other roles. She just seems to have this act for playing easily hateable characters. I don't know if it's her voice or her mannerisms. In this movie's case, it was definitely her voice, as she just sounds pretty grating in this. Her character doesn't really do all that much either. She just wants to be a villain, so she ropes Gru into helping her do a heist. Doesn't feel like a real character, and we never really see her have an arc. Having her in this movie just felt more like a waste of time. Sofía Vergara is also in this, and she just feels like another actress that's just a waste of talent here. I don't even know how much voice acting she had to do, as half the time, whenever her character would let out a laugh, it genuinely sounds like it could have been taken from like any other movie or any interview from her, because as the first time you hear it, it literally just sounds like they took that soundbite and they just repeated it every time it happened. It always sounded the exact same to me. Other than that, her character doesn't have all that much to do either. She's basically just the wife of Will Ferrell's character, but she doesn't do that much villainy herself. She kind of just stands around acting as another character who could have been written out of the movie entirely and you'd miss nothing. Speaking of reused dialogue, there were many points where minion dialogue is clearly heard from other movies once again. Not re-recorded, they sounded the exact same as they're heard in the other movies, and I would know, as I've been unfortunate enough to see all of these movies. It just proves how lazy Illumination still is, and how they'll always find ways to cheap out on money for such little things, because all of their budget seems to go into grabbing licensed songs, especially that 80s music. They fucking love buying rights to 80s heavy hitters because they know it's expensive and they know you can have it, and whenever they use these songs in their movies, it's incredibly irritating. I mean, look at the Mario movie. One of the big things that just didn't work for this movie to me was the writing itself. The writing is the most by the numbers, basic, stupid storyline that probably only took about a week to write. The writers also managed to add in a bunch of really out of taste, quote unquote, topical references. For example, they make the Joey King character character called Gru a boomer, a phrase I'm pretty sure no one has used unironically anymore. Another thing they do is give one of the minions a selfie stick. I swear I've never seen anyone even utter the word selfie stick since 2014, let alone use it. It always brings me misery to see writers be so out of touch with the current culture, especially if the younger generation. Take a movie like the newest TMNT movie. Sure, they had slang words that were used in the current year, which was last year, some that don't get used anymore, and some that still do get used. But what made it work was that it was natural. The kids playing the turtles originally improvised these on the spot. It felt more real, and that's what made it more entertaining. Jokes in this just completely fall flat a lot of the time. There was very rare occasions where families were laughing in my cinema, but not a lot were. Not a lot can be said about the performances in this. I mean, Steve Carell, firstly, is basically doing what he always does as Gru. He puts on the silly Gru voice, except now, especially with these last two sequels, I've noticed he will have a moment of over-exaggerating the voice to try and be more expressive, but it doesn't really work, and it more so just comes off as annoying. His performance has definitely changed since the first movie, since they've moved this character away from being the once iconic villain he claimed to have been, and at this point in his life seems to have no desire to go back to villainy, which I feel just seems to be because of Hollywood not wanting to make movies about villains. You see this happening all the time, and sure, even by the end of that first movie, he isn't really a villain, but I don't know, something about him being an asshole at times really brought this needed edge to his character, and that's naturally nowhere to be found here anymore. The animation isn't anything incredible either. Sure, it's bright, but other than that, what does it have going for it exactly? Just cause it's all colorful and saturated doesn't mean it's pleasing to look at, yet at the same time, it's somehow not a complete assault on the eyes, as Illumination thankfully has the budget to make a somewhat decent looking movie, but being decent isn't enough at the end of the day. It's boring, it's just stale to look at the whole time. If it wasn't obvious already, I really didn't like this movie. It's not the worst in the franchise, I'll give it that. I still had always thought the third installment was truly its weakest, even if at the time, since I was younger, I was fond of hearing some of those 80s songs in the movie. However, seeing them doing again, I find it to be just pandering garbage. There's just fundamentally and categorically too many things wrong with this movie for me to just let it go. I had a hard time trying to turn my brain off for this one, mainly as I realized I had to lock in if I truly wanted to give an in-depth review on this thing, essentially so I could have more valid reasons to just absolutely rip to shreds. Scenes just happen in this movie, and unfortunately that is not how you make a movie, and when you put scenes in, you gotta make sure there's a point for having them existing. I know this is a small thing to ask, I know that everybody knows this, I'm basically directly telling Illumination this at this point. There's just multiple moments where there just isn't anything going on, and it's just not the case where scenes actually have a point. It slowly just becomes an absolute chore to watch. I'm giving Despicable Me 4 1.5 stars. It's a very incompetent, annoying, garbagely written, lazily animated kids movie that acts as nothing more but cannon fodder for parents who feel no need to take care of their kids. Because why should they when they can just shove this in their face for an hour and a half because it has a bunch of loud and bright colors with the funny minions in it. This franchise is long overdue a retirement, as I can't believe we are nearly halfway into the 20s and we still have to live with the minions in our public consciousness. They've been such a stain on pop culture. I genuinely would love to see an alternate reality where the first Despicable Me movie was never made, where we never got the minions. But yeah, at the end of the day, I just really hated this one. It's just fundamentally a really bad movie. Don't go see this. Just don't go see this. I think this may have broken something in my brain.